Hello and welcome to the European Resilience Initiative Center video podcast. Today our guest is Yevhenii Monastyrskyi. He is a historian, he's a lecturer at the Kyiv School of Economics, and he is a Ph.D. student at Harvard University. Welcome, Yevhenii.
Thank you for having me, Sergej.
Thank you that you have found time for this conversation. You are a historian. You are a Ukrainian historian who originates from Donbas, and not from Donbas in general, but from the city of Luhansk, which had been occupied by the Russians in 2014 and still is occupied. When this war between Russia and Ukraine started over 10 years ago, in many Western media, it was called as a conflict in Donbas or war in Donbas. Is this name somehow correct, incorrect? Many Ukrainians say it's even toxic. What is wrong with this name?
So there are at least three parts to this question in the way one can answer it. So to begin with the definitions, like somebody calls war in Eastern Ukraine, somebody calls conflict in Eastern Ukraine, somebody calls use Donbas as a specific regional toponym. Somebody is not using this and just calling it generally Eastern Ukraine. First of all, about terminology, war or conflict. When we talk about the legislative field or the field of the international law, there's no war as a concept. There's a conflict. There's armed conflict, and there are a variety of conflicts. And when we talk about this in very specific international legalistic terms, we call it conflict. This is usually fine. Ukrainians, though, and me being one of them, prefer using war as a more direct word, which has also emotional and historical connotations, because conflict doesn't have this emotional.
Indeed, like I can have conflict with my employer. That doesn't mean that I come with a bazooka to his office and kill everyone who is there.
Yes, exactly. Well, this would be homicide. This is also different different concept. In this case, when we use word conflict, it's maybe more suitable for, I don't know, this spaces of international negotiations or any kind of international court, whatever. So like any space where this language matters. In the everyday communication, it's important to signify something as something which bears meaning. And conflict, as you said, bears very vague meaning in everyday life of every person, while war is something very specific. People usually have very direct associations with this word.
We don't say world war conflict or second world conflict, but regarding the terminology Donbas, can we use Donbas as the name?
So this is the second part of the problem I've identified in the beginning. So second part comes with the Donbas or Eastern Ukraine. Both definitions are fine, and both definitions are functional. Nobody can like gag you for using them. Though again, Donbas became, especially in Ukrainian context, though in an international in a certain way too, became a toxic term, mostly associated with war. And while in international field is maybe more useful for Ukraine to use Donbas as a signifier, because now everybody knows where it is, while Eastern Ukraine is too vague and too broad to define the battlefield or line of contact before full-scale invasion. At the same time, Donbas became toxic for displaced persons, first and foremost for displaced persons who come from the region, specifically because for lots of people in Ukraine, for lots of Ukrainians before the full-scale invasion, the term Donbas was gradually becoming more and more associated with war. Therefore, people who come from there, who were running from war, who were escaping war zones, were usually unfairly, or pretty often unfairly associated with war, and they were carrying the stigma of the region on their backs. And this created this second tension to the definition, this toxicity of the term Donbas. So we can use both, and there's no restrictions. We just have to be mindful where we're using this and in which context, and who may be or may not be your audience.
That's a great answer. And we're talking to Yevhenii Monastyrskyi, who is a historian. He's a lecturer at the Kyiv School of Economics, and he's a Ph.D. student at Harvard University. And Yevhenii, you are originating from the region of Donbas, the Ukrainian region, that there is a long history of Donbas, and the name itself is pretty new. It's not like a name which comes from Middle Ages, like Saxony or Bavaria, or I don't know, Scotland or Wales or Lombardia. What is behind this name? What is the history of this definition?
So basically, this is a term which came with modernization. And by modernization, I mean the urge of 19th century to industrialize, beginning with the early 19th century British Industrial Revolution, which was carrying the Age of Empires basically until its end with the First World War. Here we have to be very careful with the definition. So Donbas is economical geographical term, and if it will go to the roots of this term, it will have nothing, only partially it will be related to the region of Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast itself. Only Donetsk Oblast will be more or less full in this, like in its totality, will be part of the Donbas as an economical region, and Luhansk Oblast only half of it, the basically southern part, which was occupied before the full-scale invasion. And so this region, this term, has first and foremost to do with huge potential of the region in 19th century, beginning late 18th century, as a hotbed for the industrialization of Russian Empire. First of all, this was a place where the coal and iron ore were locating very closely, creating very useful place to produce, first of all, pig iron, and basically stock the military. So Luhansk, for instance, is one of the first big cities, well, basically industrial cities founded in the region, specifically for that matters. So it used to be a Kazakh settlement, and this was basically for a very long time the main purpose of the region. It wasn't, as any region in the world, it wasn't just the empty space. The empty spaces are pretty much deserted and unlivable spaces. It was a in a certain way liminal and borderlands space where usually people were living on the big distances between each other. And after uprisings in unsuccessful, usually uprisings of Kazakhs in 17th century, they were usually choosing this space to settle. Usually because there's more often because there's because the arm of the law was not long enough to get them there.
Let me interrupt you here, because I'm afraid like some people who listen us have an impression they're listening to Tucker Carlson speaking to Vladimir Putin and asking themselves in what century we are now. Because as you said, Donbas is a pretty economic sociologic term. It was, if I'm not mistaken, created like in 19th century, later 18 maybe at earliest, if I'm not mistaken. Please correct me if I'm wrong. But when you talk about the Cossack settlement and the more or less empty land without any like imperial Russian control, where you could escape if you have problem with the Tsarist Russian Empire. We are talking about 17th century.
To be honest, the whole history of Donbas until and sometimes after First World War was a space where people could escape and hide from the long arm of the law. Rather, in 19th century, when this industrialization began, especially when the coal mines started to appear, coal mines were also this space where people could literally hide from the law underground.
And this empty. I'm sorry for interrupting you, just like because the topic is so complex, and I want that our audience like really understands the details and the connections of the dots between the dots. The area was empty because what? It was like not that far. It was pretty central. It was not like surrounded by rivers or lakes or sea or mountain ranges. Why was it empty?
It wasn't empty. So this is my point. The point number the first point is that it wasn't empty, and it wasn't, and this industrial region haven't appeared what we say ex nihilo out of nothing. It wasn't established on the empty space. It wasn't just industrial zone which was settled by random people coming to develop, say industrial coal mining and iron making. It's not something of a Urals situation. It was more or less populated, not as densely populated. One have to say, area mostly by Slavic people first, then more or less people who would today we would call Ukrainians. And again, this is here we talk about like the very vague understanding of national identity in the times when national identity is itself mostly defined by empires and kingdoms, and nationhood has nothing to do with this. It's mostly a religion. Later on, in 18th century, the industry comes in, but mostly in a very pointed way, when Russian Empire tries to not just only embolden their borderland and say embolden their control over the Black Sea region, but most of all because the industrial potential of the Russian Empire to control the Black Sea was rather minuscule, especially when it comes to the military control, the basically maritime control of the seas. And one have to, like, again, this is like the basic story, but one have to understand that in 18th century most of the Russian ships were built in Baltic Sea and in Moscow, and they needed to be sent down the rivers through the Don River to Sea of Azov and then to the Black Sea. However, the industrial potential of producing cannons was not enough, and was not big enough. And that's the moment when the coal mining and search for iron ore happens in this what used to be southwestern part of Russian Empire, which today is eastern Ukraine. And for instance, Luhansk was founded specifically for this reason. First, almost 20 years of its existence, the name of the city was Luhansky Zavod. It was basically called Luhansk Factory because basically Welsh industrialist, Welsh engineer Carl Gascoigne came there as being experienced industrial. He actually built a factory, a pig iron producing factory in what's today Petrozavodsk. So basically North Karelia, north of Russia, closer to the Finnish border. He was commissioned to find the enough coal and ore to build this factory. So the basically basis of Donbas was laid back then there. Later on in 19th century, especially beginning mid-19th century, after Russia loses Crimean War and have this urge to industrialize and urge to modernize, the territories not only of today's Donbas but of most of the Ukrainian territories becomes basically a bargaining chip. in industrialization. Russian Empire was giving out those territories for concession, mostly to Western companies. By Western, I mean mostly British, German, Belgian, you name it. So places of the big Western capital, and this capital was mostly interested in investing in those not deserted land, but the land with access to coal and iron ore, and basically some other resources, close access to the seas, close access to the rivers, and, to be honest, cheap labor. It was basically what about 30 years ago was China, when all Western companies were building their factories in China because it was cheap, because it was easy to develop, because it was basically lowering the prices and making them more competitive on the world market. Basically, Eastern Ukraine and Southern Ukraine was that in second half of 19th century. And that's why we keep hearing those stories. We keep hearing those stories appearing, like the story of foundation of Donetsk, which was founded by John Hughes, also a British industrialist. Actually, the second coming of Luhansk happened because of the German industrialist family, the Hartmann family. I think they're coming from Dresden. They were one of the biggest locomotive producers in Europe, and they basically built their factory in Luhansk to rejuvenate the city. And again, just because it was cheap, it was useful, and it was also providing the source of income for Russian Empire. That's how this, basically what today is Rust Belt, came to be. It wasn't just colonized by Russians or Ukrainians. It wasn't just created by the Soviet Union, as lots of people are saying. Donbas as a concept coming on stage in second half of 19th century as Donetsk coal basin. So this is the Donbas acronym. So and it stretches from what's today is mid Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, so mid Dnieper region, up to the Rostovskaya Oblast in Russia. So it's basically coal basin. It's how we think about Ruhrland, or how we think about any how we think about any industrial zone. It has little to do with actual ethnic or state borders. It had more to do with natural resources. So Donbas in the let's call it in iconography of Soviet Union became this showcase of the industrial region and what Soviet Union has to become especially in the industrialization epoch beginning in the late 1920s. But it has longer history, and it basically concept appropriated by Soviets, and now has this weird afterlives when people mostly either associated with the Soviet and Bolshevik identity. It's basically an economic identity, and that's where the most of the identity of the region lies. It's in economics and in this resource-heavy industry.
Wow, that is absolutely astonishing, this transformation of a Western investment opportunity within the Tsarist Empire with cheap labor force, very low labor force protection, and practically an opportunity to earn your money in the area where you can do whatever you want, and which has been transformed later in a, as you said, in a Soviet dream of how the Soviet Union should look like, industrialized, etc. We are talking to Yevhenii Monastyrskyi, who is a historian who originates from Ukrainian Donbas, who is a lecturer at the Kyiv School of Economics, and who is a Ph.D. student at Harvard University. Don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to this channel, and you will be informed about interviews like this, not only about the current news, but also about the underlying tectonic processes which led to the current situation. Yevhenii, what I wanted to ask you further, you have been to Luhansk. the capital of Luhansk Oblast, one of regions of Donbas, in 2014 when the Russian tanks entered the city. And all these characteristic parts of identity of Donbas in Ukraine, with special history, with very strong role of industry, with to some extent like melting pot of social groups and ethnic groups. The Russians tried to use it during that invasion, didn't they?
They tried to use the underlying identity, which was created by the Soviet Union in the Soviet times. So it's it's actually rather hard to find in the in the what used to be the Soviet space what used to be Soviet republics, any kind of space, any kind of region where regional identity or national identity stayed where it was or was preserved in any kind. So in the context of the 2014, the first stage of invasion of Russia, especially in Donbas, it has mostly to do not with the regional identity or even not with the people's desire to have one, but mostly with invoking this nostalgia for the heavy industry being a organizer of everyday life. So one have to understand in this context that's for about 70 years of the existence of the Soviet Union, and decades before that, when the industry was booming in the region, it created the whole dynasties of people who had more or less direct relation with the heavy industry, which was defining the way of life. It was defining the everyday life up to the point when the dominating smog and the sounds of factories were making the environment around them. When the Soviet Union fell apart, economic system it created fell apart with it, and as in all parts of the Soviet Union where the industrial chains were broken, Donbas suffered greatly because of the um, first of all, the dystrophy of the industry and uselessness of this industry, because as we know, the scale of the Soviet industry was never corresponded with any kind of actual need of people of the world market, of any kind of market in those products. So in after 91, those industries were shrinking, creating joblessness, creating the deep crisis, up to the point of thousands% of inflation, and basically 90s in Ukraine were no better than 90s in Russia or 90s in Poland. We were going different directions though. By 2014, the industrial the nostalgia for this industrial capacity was still there, because generation of our of say my parents who began their life came into adulthood sometimes in 80s, their life was basically predefined by the industrial potential of the region, which will obviously need scientists, teachers, professors, etc. However, with the fall of the economics, this it's created this sense of emptiness, and Russia in 2014 used this sense of emptiness to mobilize people. So, and this is kind of eerie situation when we have to understand that's mostly what Russian government is doing inside Russia is demobilizing population. They mobilize population only, or peoples, and any kind of social groups only outside of Russia, and they usually mobilize them through hatred and nostalgia. You either have to hate someone, you have to hate Jews or Nazis or anti-Semites, or you have to have to hate LGBTQI community. You have to hate someone, and Russia will be there. In In post-Soviet countries, it's usually you have to hate your government, and you have to hate your government because it failed you. Because your region, your country, your city had some potential, and after 91, it's as if somebody is to blame for what happened. And by installing for, I would say, decades before 2014, its own media assets, its own pundits, its own local politicians and activists, Russia basically laid this or prepared its ground for the partial mobilization of the population in eastern Ukraine, and not only Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast. We saw the uprisings, the basically Russia-driven uprisings in Odessa and in Kharkiv, and attempts in Dnipro and Zaporizhia and Kherson. They were luckily struck down. In Luhansk and Donetsk, they had enough of the mobilization power, and to be honest, also Ukraine had not enough of a grip over the situation in the region. Also connected to the fact that lots of local politicians had strong pro-Russian um, ties and economical ties in the first place. Therefore, creating this almost enchanted territory when Russia came in with its proxies in March, April of 2014, there was almost no one to strike back aside from civil society, and that's what was happening until basically early May 2014, when the civil society was trying to push back, and the government was in too much of disarray after the escape of Yanukovych, and was too caught up with what happened with annexation of Crimea. So basically, Russia used this mobilization potential. However, at the same time, they used the strong local identity. So, like, if we look through sociological surveys, we will surveys which were happening before the invasion of 2014. We will see this the local identity in Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast were very strong, and they used this local identity also to hush out the most of the people. They basically, most of the people would. Well, in my experience, especially what I saw in 2014, they didn't budge. They were not interested in what's going on, and they didn't care. They didn't care mostly not because they wanted to be in Russia or didn't want to be in Ukraine, but mostly because they were ready to take whatever option there will be, as long as nobody will kind of budge them, and nobody will make them do anything. And as if somebody will promise bigger social payments, then it will be this government. So the apathy on the local population was also instrumentalized by Russia.
But that situation which you describe is absolutely scary, and it practically describes the situation when people are so much of deprived of their self-identification as a part of a nation, of as active citizens, that practically uh, any hostile actor can do, if not anything, but mostly, like, almost anything with that. And therefore, my next question: what was the reaction of people when they saw, in the morning of one of summer days or spring days, the Russian tanks on their streets? Did they
So,
realize it were the Russians?
um, I don't think there was any, like, I don't think I've seen anyone who was in doubt that it was Russians. So the whole myth about the mobilization of local coal miners who got some AK-47s from the as they used to call it, voentorg, which is like the military, I don't know, some kind of Russian military Amazon. Um, it was obvious this is not what's happening. Everybody were aware there are Russians. Most of those soldiers um, were not even very good in covering up the fact that they were from Russia. Not because they had some insignias. They're not. It was basically Crimean scenario where they had no insignia on them. And tanks, instead of the Russian flags, had the St. George ribbon, this yellow black ribbon we like to see around Berlin on the May 9th, especially in Treptower Park. So this was basically a very obvious situation. At the same time, everybody was kind of hoping for Crimea scenario. I was mostly going to places of the like crowded places and listening to people, not arguing with people. More, maybe it's a social scientist talking in me, but I was back then mostly riding a bus from one part of town to another, mostly because I was teaching in places where I was teaching. They were located in different parts of town from where I lived, and the usual situation when you go to the market or you go to the supermarket and you overhearing people speak, and people were mostly hopeful for a Crimean scenario, so bloodless takeover, because somebody was telling that um, some of their relatives got bigger pensions in Crimea, or any kind of other information bombs Russia was throwing at the local population.
But so
The
this is practically means, sorry for interrupting you, that they were buying Russia's propaganda. Because we
Yes, of
know
course.
that the occupation of Crimea was neither peaceful nor bloodless. People were killed starting from the first day of the invasion, not in the scale like today in Bakhmut or Avdiivka, but nevertheless. And this idea of higher salaries and pensions, that is what Russian television was telling them day and night.
Well, one have to understand this, like this Russian television and Russian news and Russian media was there uh, in not only in those two regions, but also in most parts of Ukraine, was freely broadcasting. This is the state of the art situation in 2014. One can argue with this. One can be judgmental or aggressive about this, but this is the basically a force of nature back then, and it's rather weird to be angry at past. It's or to be judgmental and say that people were dumb and were making stupid decisions. It's as if you can go into 1931 and say someone this year making stupid decisions because you will be shot in the Great Terror. Well, only if I knew. The situation in 2014 in most of Ukraine was like that, uh, by exception of probably Western Ukraine, some parts of Western Ukraine where Russian media wasn't as popular and as big. And of course, people were seeing this picture produced by Russian media and eating it up. It was there, and people were believing this. Obviously, the civil society, which was more pro-Ukrainian, more active, more identity driven, Ukrainian identity driven, was was rather small. The aggressive pro-Russian part of the society was also very small. So the most of the population, and here one can again go back to the argument I made a couple of minutes ago, saying that inside of Russia they mostly demobilize society. They ruin the horizontal networks, because horizontal networks are harmful for the basically for authoritarian, semi-totalitarian, use whatever word you want to describe the centralized aggressive system. And by extension, that's what happened. That was what's happening in lots of regions of Ukraine. People were largely demobilized, and that's why people also were not attentive enough to what was happening in Ukraine. That's why lots of people, lots of the population of the region were eating up what Yanukovych was doing, and only a small part of very passionate and active citizenship in Ukraine was actually aware and very um, um, uh, let's call it very acutely aware of what's going on and the about the moments need when one need to act. So again, it's easy to blame the population who was lured by the Russian media. The fact there was not a lot of options for people to just opt out from Russian media.
But you were one of the people who decided to resist the occupation. You stayed in Luhansk under the occupation and you participated in the resistance. How did it look like, and what brought you to this decision? Was it spontaneous? Was it something you were ready for already? And what was the daily life with this decision?
Well, the fact there is a certain number there are a certain number of locals in all over Ukraine today, uh, and back then, who had strong Ukrainian identity. I was lucky enough to be born after the Soviet Union fell apart, to grow up in a household where the conversation about the crimes of the Soviet Union was kind of over the table conversation, and my personal understanding, not only of the Soviet past but also the Russian present, was that I I don't want anything to do with Russia. My my personal interest and my personal desire was basically what was very stupid and very basic slogan of European future of Ukraine. So this was something, some part of youth in Luhansk, as well as everywhere in Ukraine, more or less, was looking at. This was the promise. It was I need to remind people that it was a promise of Yanukovych government, because lots of prolongation of reaction from the population was driven by the fact that Yanukovych was promising the association agreement, and this was something both our parents and our generation was kind of using as a bargaining chip. We were basically saying that we're fine with what you do as long as you're bringing us to Europe. And when Russians came, it was kind of the opposite of what was promised. And for me, the basic everyday civic resistance was the least I could do. However, already after the mid May 2014, the acts of everyday resistance was becoming harder and harder, and the curfew was established, and also people started to disappear. We you, one can overhear the talks of the people again, and in the public spaces when somebody's talking, for instance, that someone's child was taken for ransom, and usually those ransoms were uh, anywhere between 10 and 60,000 euros. That's what I've been hearing. I I at least know distantly one person whose parents paid ransom of tens of thousands of dollars to take him out from the separatist captivity. And um, me myself, I was captured by Russians in early June, in well, mid June 2014, and spent some time in captivity, or basically at some point just talking myself out of it. And basically after some rounds of tortures and humiliations, I've been let go. But after that, the all kinds of resistance went into the underground mode, because Luhansk became a basically a war zone, beginning early June and into July. More and more Ukrainian forces were Ukrainian armed forces were concentrated in and around Luhansk. So by in Luhansk, I also mean that there were places where there were, for instance, the Luhansk customs base and Luhansk the internal forces base, which were still controlled by Ukrainian army and Ukrainian border guards, which were holding off the attacks from Russians. And by early August, Luhansk becomes encircled. On August 3rd, lights went off. So one of the what's now happening all over Ukraine when energy stations are bombed and lights went out going out from in the whole cities size of Kharkiv. In Luhansk, it's happened on August 3rd. The whole city station was ruined, and for next 55 days, Luhansk was out of electricity, out of water, out of sewage, and only gas was present in those buildings where there was a gas. And this was basically a moment when whole resistance was halted because there's no means of communication. There was no internet. There was no phone connection, and the only way people and local population, and me myself, were getting any kind of information from outer world because we like imagine we usually talk about Mariupol in today's situation when somebody who survived the siege of Mariupol says that because it was the lights went off and on the second or third week of the siege, people didn't know, is Ukraine still standing? And we basically had the same situation for almost 2 months in Luhansk. The only thing which was helping lots of people is that if you had transistor strong enough, like not a lot of people remember what transistors are. Those radio points were pretty powerful one with like 6 AAA batteries. You can get Ukrainian radio from these things in Luhansk back then, and you can hear the radio, like about 5-minute news a couple times a day. And the only thing people in Luhansk were hoping for is that at least on Ukrainian side, somebody will say that's what's happening in the half a million. Is the city of the population of half a million is being cut out from the world, and people are basically like surviving almost like with the taking water out of the sewage and with a pretty limited rations.
That is absolutely impressive and terrible pictures. Of course, we're talking to Yevhenii Monastyrskyi, who is a historian and who is a lecturer at the Kyiv School of Economics and a PhD student at Harvard University. And we are talking about history of Donbas region, Luhansk Oblast, Donetsk Oblast, other regions of Ukraine, and what is happening there, what happened there before, how local identities were created, how Russia tried to use these local identities during its genocidal invasion in Ukraine in 2014 and later 2022, of course. Don't forget to like, to share, subscribe to this channel so you will not miss next interviews like that. Yevgeny, we have talked a lot about history until 2014, but the fighting of 2014, despite all the intensity back then that you have described, cannot be compared to what is happening now with mass bombardments, with the whole cities being erased and just reduced to ash. What is the situation now, and how do people in these regions, how do they perceive the situation now after already 10 years of war? I believe that nobody can have any illusions by now about what Russia is and why Ukrainian state is so important for Ukrainians who want to survive?
In Ukraine, yes. On occupied territories, no. First of all, there is very little evidence of actual sociological data we can get from occupied territories. None. In my opinion, there is no reliable way. There is no ethical way to get the actual information, actual sociological data from there. So the shortest answer would be we don't know. The more elaborated answer would be something somewhere along the lines of the next example. So, what Luhansk and Donetsk and Crimea been turned into for the last 10 years, it's a Russian showcase and Russian stronghold with all its media, with all of its resources being poured there. And by resources, I mean not only media resources, not only propaganda, but actual physical resources. If one would be so wicked to spend a lot of time to monitor local news, local Telegram channels, media outlets, any kind of local information outlets, one would see that's what Russia and Russia-controlled local media are or have been creating there for the last 10 years is the sense of normalcy. So for until the full-scale invasion, and which was prompted by the Putin's declaration of the recognition of puppet Luhansk and the next People's Republic, and then basically annexation of them into Russia. Before that, for 8 years, the local population and basically all the people who lived on occupied territories, except for Crimea, which was annexed straight away in March 2014, were living in this weird legal limbo. They didn't have banks, they didn't have ATMs, they were living in the conditions of, say, Transnistria, Abkhazia, all of the unrecognized states. They were basically self-proclaimed states. And all the bad things came with it. So like the all things about unregulated life, but also a very uncomfortable life, let's call it this way. And until 2022, until the full-scale invasion, whoever would come to Donbas, whoever would come to occupied territories and give them normal life as it was before the Russian invasion would win over the population, because people were deprived from the basic services for a very long time. Ukraine, on its part, was doing as much as possible to bring services closer to the contact line, up to the points when on checkpoints Ukrainian citizen from the occupied territories can cross the checkpoint and get bunch of services right at the Ukrainian territories and go back to where it's more comfortable for them to live. After the full-scale invasion and after this straightforward annexation, Russia is basically creating a showcase. They introducing their bank system. As we know, Russia is cut off from SWIFT, but they have their own Mir system, which makes their banks run inside Russia. And they basically introduce banks. They introduce their providers. They introduce their services. And what they used to do with Crimea, and they continue to do with Crimea, but they would now do with occupied Donbas, they take resources from one region somewhere in Russia, makes a donor of rebuilding of, say, Donbas, making Donbas a stronghold and making this ideological concept, making it something to die for, something to fight for. Why Russia live in such and such conditions? Because we're fighting for people in Donbas and they're suffering and they need to get something. So no, we cannot say today that people on occupied territories are aware of Russian crimes. They live under Russian propaganda. They live as people in, I don't know, Omsk live. They live like people in Kazan live. They live in the same informational sphere but with with the huge addition of this influx of resources coming from Russia, new buses, new roads, something else. But at the same time, there are bombings happened.
When you say like Luhansk was bombed, you mean of that military objects in
Military
Luhansk
objects,
have
yeah.
been.
So for instance, what used to be a police academy on outskirts of Luhansk was bombed a few weeks ago. There are also it located in very densely populated area around the coal mine. So there are some, as far as I saw the photos, some buildings were also like windows shattered. This same situation happens everywhere, and they portray this as the attack on the civilian infrastructure because it still functions technically as military academy, though everybody who do any kind of analysis on occupied territories know that it been used for Russian army for almost a decade. When we look at the successful strikes of the Ukrainian armed forces, we see, for instance, um, Luhansk being bombed by the precision arms like the scalps and storm shadows all the time. Just last week, there was a very, in my opinion, very funny moment when the Luhansk aviation factory was bombed. A little bit we know before the invasion of 2014, Luhansk had the remnants of the aviation factory, which was repairing some aircraft machinery since the Soviet times. Few weeks before this bombing, local media was bragging that we finally relaunching this factory, and it was bombed.
A pretty like Kafka-like situation when you say that people live there and they're so much influenced by the Russian propaganda that they don't know about the Russian war crimes in Ukraine, while they still have internet, right? They can have access to free media, or are they all banned in Russia? Like you cannot, or in Russia-controlled territories, you cannot just read on internet what is going on. How does it work? Do they identify themselves as with the Russian army now when they still get information that Kyiv was bombed or Lviv was bombed or Zaporizhia was bombed?
Again, it's hard to say, and we don't have data. So my first response that we don't know, and we will not know until we'll get any kind of data. The one, again, the obvious things which are happening in social media, and we can see in local news, that's uh, their informational menu is the same as the info menu of the person living in Voronezh or a person living in Irkutsk. It would be the same. Again, more uh, densely aggressive towards Ukraine because the front line is just there and local population dying all the time. However, one can see how on occupied territories, especially in Luhansk itself, less and less communication happens about the local people who died or were killed in action, because it at some point in 2022 it reached almost a tipping point when people were aggressively angry at Russia because it kind of just took the territory in, but they started to send tens of thousands of locals to basically in the mid grinder, like one in Bakhmut, and people were basically uh, at very weird moment when they needed to pay with the lives of the loved ones for whatever they wanted, so quote unquote wanted. In fact, what we do know is that there's a still large swaths of population who are probably as apathetic as it used to be 10 years ago, and and we cannot say that those people know about Russian war crimes or don't know, they care or they don't care. We know for sure that there is a certain amount of population who are just apathetic and depressed by this, and that's basically it.
What you're telling me is very interesting for me, because we know that in Crimea we have constant cases of local resilience until now, and surprisingly, the younger generation, age of like 14, 16, which were little kids in 2014 when Crimea was occupied by Russia, they demonstrate now pretty strong, not all of them, but a significant part, pretty strong rejection of Russia. And we know that this movement is that strong that the Russians needed to publicly address this problem in local media, calling for punishment for these teenagers and shaming them and naming them and forcing them to publicly record and broadcast it later there, apologize, which you don't do when it is a single case. You don't bring attention to this case, you just punish a person and the case is closed. And this is happening in Crimea, where people suddenly realize, the younger generation, that Ukraine is fighting a just war and Ukrainian army is cool. But I don't know if something like this happening in the Russia occupied regions of Donbas.
As far as I know, the whole movement of the yellow ribbon, the one of the more or less official or known resistance groups, are active on all parts of the occupied territories, and we know that resistance was on occupied territories of Donbas before the full-scale invasion. We know for sure there are people still who are not just sympathetic to Ukraine, but also trying to act. Those acts will, and I hope will stay as secretive as possible, and we will not know a lot about this. Mostly because we usually know about them when Russians are catching people like those teenagers. There are young Ukrainians on occupied territories, also of Donbas, who are more pro-Ukrainian than we, or more anti-Russian than we know. And we know this just not only because we hope for this, but because before the full-scale invasion, there were even special programs for teenagers, for young people from occupied territories, which were helping them to get into to universities in Ukraine, which were helping them to go for a summer vacation, well, basically summer camps for Ukrainian kids, and the whole reintegration was happening. But again, it wasn't happening on a large scale. It could not happen on a large scale. That would be simply impossible. So one have to understand that there is, and there will be rather small sliver of the population who are active and trying to do something. However, at the same time, it's really hard to imagine how to mobilize people and how make it possible for them to go into resistance. Because, well, it's hard, it's scary, it's just people are fearsome, and it's nothing new, and it's nothing surprising about this. However, the closer Ukrainian victory will be, the more people will be looking for opportunities to go into Ukrainian side, because this is the other thing we will have to deal with when the war will be over. The reintegration of these territories will have to involve not only the reestablishment of the control of the border, which is the easy part to do after the victory. The hard part will be the reintegration of the people, and making sure that those people, that's first of all the illustration and the whole procedure of the transitional justice will happen before we can go into the rebuilding of the region. And there's a long way to this, and one have to be very passionate, uh, and one have to also be very open to talk with those people, and will be probably the hardest thing to do.
Absolutely, a mammoth task for reintegration of the region, which have been occupied since 10 years, and a lot of damage has been done there. Terror, exchange of population, war damage, stress, everything. And of course, the whole generation of kids have been raised under the Russian occupation. Those children who are 18 now and are conscripted into Russian army against international law, they were just 8 years old when Russia came to Ukrainian Donbas and occupied both parts of Donetsk and Luhansk oblast. We have talked to Yevhenii Monastyrskyi, who is a historian from Ukrainian Donbas, from the city of Luhansk. He is a lecturer at the Kyiv School of Economics, and he's a Ph.D. student at Harvard University. Thank you, Yevhenii, for your insightful talk. Thank you for your time, and stay strong.
Thank you.
And don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to this channel. And if you have any person who you would like to watch this video, feel free to send a link of this or maybe other interviews as well. Stay with our channel, stay with Ukraine.